Okay, in this presentation, we're going to talk about what we can know about Jesus. Of course, when we say we can know something about Jesus, we're talking about having historical knowledge. And I'm going to break this up into a little acronym here called POWER, P-O-W-E-R. So hopefully this is an easy way to remember some of these issues. And when we talk to people about Jesus and their skepticism about the New Testament, skepticism about what we can know historically about Jesus, you can possibly use this as a little memory tool. So let's move forward here. Now, there's no doubt in the days of Jesus, they didn't have access to any video cameras, internet, obviously no phones or texting or television. So sometimes people expect, the way information is transmitted today, we sometimes assume that's the way it was in the first century. Now, you might say, well, nobody believes that, but sometimes the skepticism that comes up in an indirect way kind of points to that. People expect information to travel very quickly, and they expect just a overload of information to be available in the first century about Jesus. And sometimes people, pose questions or objections that show they just don't understand the first century culture. So when it comes to looking at the historical Jesus or what we can know about Jesus, there's no doubt that everything that took place at that time is in the past. None of us were there to participate in it, and we have to rely on the tools of history. We have to rely on what we have in written sources or written documents, including primary and secondary sources. We have to ask if we have any witnesses, the testimony of any witnesses who wrote about Jesus, whether it be orally or written sources. We have to ask if there's any archaeology or external data that's been left behind to confirm the events in the New Testament. And then we, of course, can ask questions like, what's the best explanation for the birth of the Jesus movement? That's what historians do. They look at cause and effect relationships, and they can ask, what's the best explanation for the birth of this religious movement in the first century? So those are some of the tools that all historians use, no matter if it's in the past or in the present. But there's no doubt that many things are in the past, and we were not there to participate in them, so we don't have what's called direct evidence. Of course, in a court of law, many people rely on circumstantial evidence. That's the way cold case investigations work and other things. So we just need to realize it's okay that we don't have direct evidence. We just need to have access to those tools to help us explain what happened in history. So I'm going to break this down into P-O-W-E-R. We're going to start with Paul's letters. Then we're going to look at oral tradition or oral memory, and then we'll look at written tradition, and then something called early manuscripts, and then receptions. So we're going to break it down in this format. So let's start with P, with Paul's letters. So David Hackett Fisher wrote a long time ago that there's no doubt that historians want the earliest evidence. They want the earliest manuscripts or earliest documents that are closest to the event itself. So there's no doubt that, as I said, we don't have access to the Jesus, we don't have access to the events in the New Testament direct evidence, but we can look for the earliest sources that we have. And the earliest sources we have for the life of Jesus are Paul's letters. So Paul's letters are not written as gospels. Obviously, they're not biographies. They're written to different communities addressing different doctrinal and community issues, but they do mention things about Jesus in the letters, and they're written dated somewhere between 48 and 68 AD, because most the dating for Paul coming to faith is between 30 and 40. And then, of course, we have Paul writing these documents, and that means the information he received in these documents was received before he wrote them. And so that means there was like there was information is being decimated or transmitted before even Paul wrote the actual letter. So that means he received it before he wrote it down. So when it comes to written and oral sources, they're divided into two kinds, primary and secondary. A primary source is a testimony of an eyewitness. A primary source must have been produced by a contemporary of the events it narrates. And then a secondary source is the testimony source of anyone who is not an eyewitness, that is, of one who was not present at the events which he tells. And so sometimes a secondary source will rely on a primary source. That means that the secondary source will talk to the eyewitnesses to get their information. So Paul's a little bit of a mix of both because he did have a direct experience with Jesus on the Damascus Road, as is recorded in the book of Acts, but we know that he was not an original disciple. That means that he wasn't one of the 12. He didn't follow Jesus from the beginning. And what we see in some of his letters, especially 1 Corinthians 15, is that he had to receive some of the information about Jesus from the other apostles. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. He's just getting his doctrinal information or some historical information about Jesus from the other apostles, as we will see here. Even Bart Ehrman agrees that these 7 letters are undisputed. They are it's agreed upon that Paul wrote these letters: Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and others. So I do believe there's good evidence that Paul wrote all his letters. I don't have time to go into that, but the point is that even in the undisputed letters, there's enough information to talk about some issues about what we can know about Jesus. So this is a little bit of the timeline there. We see that between 40 and 50, or 40 to 60, that Paul wrote a lot of his letters, and the core gospel teaching was being preached very early on, the gospel being Jesus died and rose from the dead. And that creed that Paul received between 30 and 40 in 1 Corinthians 15 is received somewhere, as I said here, between 30 and 40 AD. And so Paul wrote a lot of his letters, as I said, they were early, and also the information he received was even before that, as I talked about before. As I said, this creed here in 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about the information he received about the Messiah dying for our sins and rising from the dead, his burial, death, and resurrection. And this received word means that Paul received this information from somebody else, another source, which means it was transmitted orally. And of course, as I've talked about before, he probably received this from Peter in Galatia when he was going up to Jerusalem. So the point is that the information Paul receives about Jesus is very early on, and that is one of the earliest sources we have, that letter right there, that creed in 1 Corinthians 15. And then you have Romans chapter 1, 1 to 5. Romans is dated between 55 and 56 AD, where Paul talks about Jesus' resurrection again there, that he's a descendant of David and that he's been risen from the dead. You also have 1 Thessalonians. There's information there about Jesus being raised from the dead. And so the point is that Paul's letters are dated early. As I said, the information he received in these letters is at even an earlier date before he wrote them down. So we have an early transmission, an early proclamation of Jesus' death and resurrection, especially his resurrection. Now, if you want to go deeper on this, you can get David Wenham's book, From Good News to the Gospels. What did the first Christians say about Jesus? He talks about the oral format in the early proclamation by Paul, and how there was an early tradition that's being circulated in the early Messianic community about Jesus. But if you want to go deeper on that, you can get this book. It came out over the last year or so, or 2 years. So the point is that we need to remember that in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 8, and 1 Corinthians 11, 23, along with other short creeds, including 2 Timothy and Romans 1, 3 to 4, show that the core teachings of the gospel, Jesus died for our sins and rose again, predate Paul. We see the core of the gospels being circulated very early, and even before Paul was a believer. Therefore, the story of Jesus was not invented at a later date. Now, sometimes skeptics will bring up that Paul never said anything about the earthly Jesus. This is a skeptical tactic of skeptics, where they say Paul only spoke about the heavenly Jesus. There's nothing really about historical or earthly Jesus in his writings. This is not true at all, because you can see that in Paul's writings he mentions little details about Jesus's historical life, such as Jesus's Jewish ancestry, his Davidic descent, that he was born of a woman, he was born under Jewish law, he had brothers, he had disciples. He talks about Paul knew Peter and James. He talks about Jesus's poverty, his humility, his meekness, his gentleness. Some of the other teachings that Jesus taught are in harmony with what Paul said. And so the point is that Paul did mention some details about the historical life of Jesus. And so to say that he never mentioned anything about a real historical figure such as Jesus or anything about Jesus's historical life is just nonsense. So we don't want to make this huge divide between the heavenly Jesus and the earthly Jesus as skeptics do. Of course, sometimes people say, well, Paul never seems to have met Jesus. He never said he met Jesus directly. So the point is that Paul needed to have met Jesus to know anything about Jesus, and this is a silly objection. So once again, we need to know the difference between primary and secondary sources. And we need to ask if we were really able to, if we should just dismiss all writings because the author never met the person directly. Of course, I have biographies on my shelf of people that never met the person they're writing about. And we know that Paul makes it clear he knew all about the early Jesus movement. He had to know something that was going on because he persecuted it severely in the book of Acts. And so even if he never met Jesus directly, we don't know for sure if he ever did because the New Testament doesn't say so. The point is he knew a lot about the early Jesus movement, what they were proclaiming. And so it's really a silly objection to say that we can't know anything about Paul says about Jesus unless he knew Jesus at the beginning or met him directly. Sometimes people object and they say, well, Paul's revelatory or visionary encounter with Jesus is no different than Muhammad and Joseph Smith. In other words, a frequent claim among world religions is that the truth has been grounded in religious revelation, and so there's just no way to differentiate between these revelations. They're conflicting. We just need to remember that, well, Paul did say he claimed to receive the gospel by revelation, the book of Galatians. He also says in 1 Corinthians 15 that he received the creed there about the death and resurrection of Jesus, and that was corroborated by other apostles. So the whole starting point of the faith of the early believers is not dependent just on Paul's individual experience. There's multiple witnesses to Jesus' resurrection that can be corroborated by the others, whereas Joseph Smith's revelation was by himself. Many of the original witnesses in Mormonism left the Mormon church or they were excommunicated. Of course, Muhammad's encounter was in a cave with the angel Gabriel, and then of course he thought that Allah was speaking through the angel Gabriel, but the point is that those were not corroborated. Multiple eyewitnesses there to the initial revelation. You only have a couple individuals there, Joseph Smith and Muhammad, whereas the apostles had multiple sightings of Jesus' resurrection. There were multiple sightings there. Let's talk about the O here, which is for oral tradition or oral memory. We sometimes ask, how can the witnesses in the New Testament remember and record the information accurately? If you want to study more on the issue of oral tradition or oral memory, you need to get Eric Eves' book, Behind the Gospels, Understanding the Oral Tradition. He goes over the different models that are out there of oral tradition. And he says in his book, of course, we know that in the Gospels, Jesus is seen as a rabbi and teacher. We know there had to be an oral phase of the Jesus story because everything is passed on orally before it is written. Of course, all we have is the written phase right now. We can study that written phase because we don't have access to the oral phase, but there had to be an oral phase on some level. But we know that Jesus was a Torah teacher. We know that Jewish people had to memorize a lot of information growing up. We know that basically in Jewish education that there was a synagogue, the home, and the elementary school, and they had to memorize large sections of the Tanakh or the Jewish scriptures. And so the point is that they could memorize large amounts of information, and Jesus certainly taught them over and over and over. So it's not as if they were incapable of memorizing and remembering the stories about Jesus or the sayings of Jesus. It's not like it's impossible for them to do that. We know that in this book that Robert Stein wrote a long time ago, he talked about the way Jesus communicated to his disciples. He used a lot of teaching techniques that would allow them, the disciples, to memorize the information. A lot of Jesus' teaching was poetic. He used a lot of Jewish techniques and ways of teaching to help them to memorize and learn. So certainly it was possible that Jesus could teach correctly and teach in a way that they could memorize it and remember it. We know there's many passages where it talks about the ability or the importance of hearing and remembering what Jesus said. We look at these in these quotes right here in the New Testament. I'm proof texting a little bit here, but I don't have time to copy down all the original context. But the point is that there's an emphasis on remembering what Jesus said, on what he said, and not just being sloppy with it. An emphasis on remembering, memorizing the words of Jesus. And then we get into the written tradition. That's the W for the rest of the Gospels, Matthew, Luke, John, Mark, and then we could talk about Acts a little bit, the book of Acts. Now, when it comes to eyewitnesses, there's something that Richard Bauckham talks about in his book, Jesus and Eyewitnesses. He talks about direct autopsy and indirect autopsy. The word eyewitness comes from the word where we get the word autopsy from. And so being a direct witness or having direct autopsy is when the historian was there to participate in the events. That means that someone directly participated in them, such as we believe about Matthew or John. They would be considered direct eyewitnesses. And then we have a case of indirect autopsy where the author was not actually there. I mean, they were there, but they didn't actually participate in the events, and then they have to rely on the direct witnesses. So, for example, Mark relies a lot on Peter for his information. Luke relies on other witnesses, as we see in Luke chapter 1. But the point is that the witnesses had to be alive at the time of the events, even though they may not have participated in them directly. For example, I talked about Luke here. He talks about how he relied upon those eyewitnesses who were from the beginning ministers of the word. He talks about how they handed them down, and that is obviously a Jewish transmission, oral transmission that's taking place, and Luke is relying on them to get his information. So Luke was not a direct eyewitness of the events recorded in his gospel, but we know that he used the personal information from those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. And what we can see, he was a man of scholarly methods with a commitment to accuracy and reliability of his production. We know that Luke gives the correct titles for the following officials. He talks about all these officials and people and places that have been confirmed in archaeology and external evidence. And so Luke was not committed to being sloppy by any means. He definitely was very detailed in his recording of these events and people and events. And as I said, Mark relied a lot on Peter, as far as we know that the earliest traditions tend to favor the fact that Mark must have been written after Peter's death. Of course, Mark names Simon with reference to Peter 7 times and Peter 19 times. And we know that this is considerably higher than in much longer Gospels of Matthew and Luke, as Bauckham talks about. We know that Papias said that Mark scribed Peter's teachings. We know that the early fathers talked about Peter's influence on the Gospel of Mark. So there's no doubt that both Mark and Luke are relying on other eyewitnesses to get their information. There's nothing wrong with that, though. Now, sometimes people complain that the gospel authors don't have their names on the gospels, or they're not clear. It doesn't say at the beginning this is written by Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. But we need to remember when Plutarch wrote his biographies in antiquity, which we have about 50 of them, that his name is absent from all the biographies. And most classical authors did include their names in the biographies. And we are pretty sure from at least modern historians are fairly certain that Plutarch wrote them, even though his name is not on all his biographies. And so we shouldn't apply a double standard here. We need to remember that that is the way classical authors operate. And so just remember the comparison to Plutarch. We know that Matthew seems to be familiar with the geography and Jewish customs and Jewish history. We know that he displays a concern for the Torah. He puts an emphasis on the evangelistic mission to the Jewish nation as well. We know that he shows a familiarity with Jewish exegesis. It seems to be very clear that Matthew has a very good knowledge of money as well, something a tax collector would have to have. He mentions so many issues about money in the Gospel of Matthew that it shows that he's very well really well read in that area. And so it would seem to favor someone that is a tax collector that wrote the book of Matthew. So That is just some evidence for Matthew being the author of the book of Matthew. I'm not saying that we know 100%, but I'm saying whoever it is would have knowledge of this information. So because we don't have, remember as I said, we have different kinds of witnesses. We have direct autopsy and indirect autopsy. We need to remember there's something that J. Warner Wallace talks about. He talks about what's called firsthand experience or eyewitnesses, which include description of events and occurrences that they personally observed and experienced. And then there's called firsthand access eyewitnesses, which include descriptions of events and occurrences that they did not personally observe, but were aware of the basis of information given to them by someone else at the time. So that would be an example of what Luke and Mark are doing right there, because obviously they were getting their information from another eyewitness or someone else at that time. And then we have firsthand knowledge, and that includes eyewitnesses that include descriptions of general cultural conditions and truths that were part of the common knowledge of the time, even though they had no direct experience or observation upon which to rely. So Luke is similar to that as well. He seems to display a good knowledge of the cultural conditions and truths that were part of the common knowledge of that time. We know here that these historical persons are mentioned in the New Testament, especially in Luke and Acts. So Luke mentions a lot of these names that are verified through archaeology. He has a knowledge of the customs and the places and the people of the time. So Luke is certainly recording history. And then John's Gospel, which is talked a lot here in the book by Craig Blomberg, the historical reliability of John's Gospel, it says that it talks about how John was obviously an eyewitness of the events of Jesus' life, since he speaks from a perspective of having been there during many of the events of Jesus' ministry, and the author displays a good knowledge of Israel's geography, of Israeli geography and customs. And John's Gospel mentions 59 historically confirmed or historically eyewitness details. So John seems to be familiar with the customs at the time and the geography. And then we have some evidence for Jesus outside the New Testament. I'm just going to mention briefly. F.F. Bruce wrote a book a long time ago called Jesus and Christian Origins Outside the New Testament. He concluded that through the writings of the writings outside the New Testament, that we can at least know some things about Jesus here, these 12 points right here. These are talked about in greater detail in the book by Van Voorst here, called Jesus Outside the New Testament, Introduction to the Ancient Evidence, Studying Historical Jesus. It's also talked about in the Jesus Legend, A Case for the Historical Reliability of Synoptic Jesus Tradition by Paul Rossetti and Gregory Boyd. They have a chapter on that, very thorough, where they critique all the outside sources and talk about the pros and cons of each one. They're very honest. So those are some resources if you want to go deeper on that topic. Now, sometimes people say, well, we can't trust the New Testament because it's written by the insiders. They're biased. They embellished or fabricated the documents. In response to that, just remember, being biased about something does not mean that you cannot tell the truth. In many cases, bias means someone is more inclined to get the story correct. And if they are lying or fabricating something, I think that you need to demonstrate where they are lying or fabricating something. So I always ask the person to demonstrate specifically where there is an outright lie or fabrication. I'm not saying that texts aren't disputed. I'm just saying that the person needs to be able to show us exactly where that fabrication is happening. Remember, the Gospels also, as far as genre, they are a type of biography. This is talked about in Richard Burridge's book, What Are the Gospels? They're an early form of biography containing the words and deeds of a historical person. And they're also a form of testimony, as Richard Bauckham talks about here in his second edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as eyewitness testimony. Obviously, if we can't trust testimony, we're going to have a hard time trusting anything in the New Testament, because we have a lot of testimony. We have a lot of people talking about what they had seen and heard and experienced. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be somewhat skeptical of testimony. I mean, we have to test the eyewitnesses and see if they're telling the truth. But the point is that the New Testament and the Gospels are certainly a form of testimony. And so if you want to go deeper on that topic, you need to get his book, which I think is available on Kindle for $2.99 right now. And then finally, let's wrap up with the early manuscript evidence. Now, I am going to just briefly mention a couple things. If you want to go deeper on this topic on textual criticism and the reliability of the manuscripts, I recommend this current book that just came out, Myth and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, because apologists tend to repeat a lot of really bad arguments about manuscript reliability. And so if you want to go deeper on that topic and look at a really updated version of all the evidence and which talks about the pros and cons of some of the arguments that are used, that is a book to get. I'm in the middle of reading it right now. We talk about how the New Testament has more manuscripts than anything else in antiquity. But the one problem with this argument is that just remember, just because you have a lot of manuscripts doesn't mean you have a reliable event. It doesn't mean the content in the manuscripts is something that is trustworthy, meaning that it happened. All the manuscripts can do is it helps textual critics to compare them. And the more manuscripts we have, the more we can study the event, the more we can compare what they say. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the event happened and all the things in the manuscripts are reliable. We have to use other tests for historicity to do that. And of course, we know that we do have more accurately copied manuscripts of the New Testament. That can be tested through textual criticism, but from what we can see, we can come up with a fairly reliable manuscript that's been copied. But just like I said, you need to do all your homework in that book that just came out. I just mentioned right there, because I want to be careful about how we use this argument. And of course, some of the scribal errors and things that are in the original manuscripts that can be done through textual criticism have shown that you may be missing some words. There may be some words that are missing, and which mean that it may question, can we really know what the original said? But they have shown that with the variations that we can still arrive at the meaning. Just for example, right here, if you have some letters missing in this sentence, obviously you could still make out what it's saying. So in some cases, that is a case where we can still make out the actual meaning, even though there are some words missing or some letters missing or some scribal errors. But as far as studying the variants, I recommend getting that book, and then you can go deeper on that. But the point is that from what we know, we can still get the meaning. Even Bart Ehrman agrees in his book, where was skeptical about the New Testament. He does say some of the variants and the debates still don't take away the meaning of what we can know about core doctrines of our faith. And as D.A. Carson says here, of the 22,000 lines in the New Testament, only 40 are contested, about 400 words. The rest are given over 99.5 transmission accuracy, and none affect any significant doctrine. As he said here, that some people say the Bible's been translated and recopied so many times is really quite uninformed. He says the purity of the text is of such a substantial nature that nothing we believe to be true and nothing we're commanded to do is in any way jeopardized by the variant readings. That was written in the book, The King James Version Debate, 1979. But the point is that, as I said once again, go to that book on textual criticism, as I mentioned, if you want to get the updated arguments on this topic. And then finally, for the R, for reception, of course, we read about what Jesus said in our English Bibles. Obviously, some people may say, well, it wasn't written in English. That's true. It was written in Hebrew and Greek. So if you're worried about the English translations and you're saying we just can't know anything, my advice to you is to learn the languages so you can read the Bible in the original languages, and you can, test it yourself and translate yourself. So we're not fully dependent on English translations. Obviously, people can read English translations and they can compare them and read critics and scholars on problems in English translations. But if you really are complaining that much and you're worried about it, then you're just going to have to learn the languages, and you can read the original Hebrew and Greek as far as, or at least read the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation that they used in the New Testament. You could read the Old Testament in Hebrew. So point is that you can learn the languages to get a better understanding. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I hope this is a helpful introduction of how you can talk about some of the ways we can attain historical knowledge about Jesus.